The text message came through at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Christine sat at the kitchen island in their Portland brownstone, laptop open to quarterly reports she'd been reviewing for her consulting firm. Her phone lit up beside her wine glass. Andrew's name. She picked it up expecting something mundane, perhaps that his flight had been delayed. Instead, 7 words that would dismantle 12 years of marriage. Running late. Catching up with Sarah tonight. Christine read it twice. Then she set the phone down gently, as if it were made of something fragile. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath stayed even. She took one sip of wine, closed her laptop, and walked to the bedroom. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the king-sized bed they'd shared for over a decade, at the framed photo of their wedding day on his nightstand, at the closet where his suits hung in perfect rows. Then she turned and walked to the garage, pulled down 2 leather suitcases from the overhead storage, and began to pack. What Andrew didn't know was that Christine had been watching the pattern for 6 months. Welcome to Leora Folktales, where we bring you stories of betrayal, resilience, and justice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust. If this story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Are you Team Christine? Let's find out together. Now back to the story. The late meetings that smelled like perfume he didn't recognize. The sudden interest in working out again at 43. The way he'd started password protecting his phone after years of leaving it casually on the counter. She was a strategic consultant who built million-dollar turnaround plans for failing companies. She knew how to read data. She knew how to spot patterns. And she knew exactly what she was looking at. Christine had met Andrew Chun 14 years ago at a tech conference in Seattle. He was a senior software architect at a growing startup. She was building her consulting practice from the ground up, sleeping 4 hours a night and living off coffee and ambition. He'd approached her after her panel on operational efficiency, told her she was brilliant, asked if she wanted to grab dinner. 6 months later they were engaged. 2 years after that, married in a small ceremony overlooking the Columbia River Gorge. They'd built what looked like the perfect partnership. He climbed to VP of engineering at a major software company. She grew her firm to 15 employees, servicing clients across the Pacific Northwest. They bought the brownstone in Portland's Pearl District. They talked about children someday when the timing was right. They hosted dinner parties where everyone commented on how well matched they were, how they finished each other's sentences, how they were clearly best friends as much as spouses. What their friends didn't see was the slow erosion that had begun 3 years ago. Andrew's promotion to VP had come with longer hours, more travel, more pressure. Christine's firm had hit a growth plateau that demanded her complete focus to break through. They started operating like colleagues who shared a home rather than partners who shared a life. Conversations became transactional. Intimacy became scheduled and eventually abandoned. They stopped fighting because they stopped caring enough to fight. But Christine had assumed they were in a rough patch that time and effort would repair. She'd been planning to suggest couples therapy after she closed her current major contract. She'd been thinking about scaling back her work to make more space for them. She'd been operating under the belief that their foundation was still solid, that 12 years of history meant something, that the man she'd married still existed somewhere under the distance and distraction. The text message about Sarah had shattered that assumption with surgical precision. Sarah Martinez, Andrew's college girlfriend, the one he dated for 3 years before they broke up when he moved to Seattle for his first tech job. The one he'd mentioned casually about 2 months ago, saying she'd reached out on LinkedIn after moving back to Portland for a position at Nike. The one he'd said he grabbed coffee with once, just to catch up on old times, nothing Christine needed to worry about. He'd smiled when he told her. Easy. Comfortable. Like he was sharing something completely innocent. And maybe that first coffee had been innocent. Or maybe it hadn't. Either way, by 11:47 p.m. on this particular Tuesday, they'd clearly progressed well past coffee. Christine packed methodically. Suits first, folded with tissue paper. Then dress shirts, casual wear, shoes. She didn't throw things. She didn't cry. She moved with the same focused efficiency she brought to client presentations. She'd learned a long time ago that emotion was a luxury you couldn't afford when you needed to think clearly. By 1 in the morning, both suitcases were packed and standing by the front door like sentries. She'd included everything she thought he'd need for about 2 weeks. Enough time for him to find somewhere else to stay. Enough time for her to change the locks and consult with the divorce attorney. She made herself a cup of tea, sat back down at the kitchen island, and began making a list. Andrew came home at 1:34 a.m. She heard his key in the lock, heard him pause when he saw the suitcases. He walked into the kitchen with the careful steps of someone who knew they'd been caught but wasn't sure how badly. He was still wearing the outfit he'd left in that morning, charcoal pants and a blue button-down, but his collar was loose and his hair had that rumpled look that came from someone running their fingers through it. He looked at Christine. She looked back, her hands wrapped around her tea mug, her expression as neutral as if they were discussing weekend plans. "Christine," he started. His voice had that rehearsed quality of someone who'd been preparing their explanation in the car. "I can explain." She took a sip of tea. "I'm sure you can. But I'm not particularly interested in hearing it right now." He blinked. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. Men who cheated, in her experience, expected tears or rage or dramatic accusations. They prepared for the emotional storm. They didn't know what to do with calm. "The suitcases," he asked, "are what you'll need for the next couple of weeks while you figure out your living situation," she said. "We'll need to discuss the house and assets, but that can wait until I've spoken with an attorney." The color drained from his face. "You're not even going to let me explain what happened?" Christine set down her mug with deliberate care. "Andrew, you sent me a text message at almost midnight telling me you were catching up with your ex-girlfriend. You came home at 1:30 in the morning smelling like wine and her perfume. I'm 41 years old and I've been building corporate strategies for 15 years. I don't need an explanation. I need you to take your things and leave." His mouth opened, closed. He looked genuinely shocked, as if he'd somehow convinced himself this wouldn't have consequences, or that Christine would be too conflict-averse to enforce boundaries, or that 12 years of marriage meant she'd simply absorb this betrayal and move on. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked. The question was so absurd she almost laughed. "I imagine the same place you were until 1:30 this morning would be a good start," she said. "Or a hotel. Or your brother's place in Beaverton. I genuinely don't care, Andrew. But you're not staying here." He stood there for another 30 seconds, looking between her and the suitcases like he was waiting for her to break, to cry, to give him an opening to turn this into a conversation where he could manage her emotions and negotiate his way back in. But Christine had spent her entire career sitting across tables from men who underestimated her, who assumed that being calm meant being weak, who thought they could outmaneuver her if they just said the right words. She'd learned to wait them out, to let silence do the work. Andrew picked up the suitcases. "We should talk about this when you've calmed down," he said. It was his last mistake of the night. "I am calm," Christine said. "That's what you're misreading. Call me when you've found an attorney. We'll coordinate from there." He left. She heard his car start in the driveway, heard him pull away into the November rain. Then she locked the door, went upstairs, and slept better than she had in months. What Andrew didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd stopped paying attention to her work years ago, was that Christine had just closed the largest contract of her career. A 3-year consulting agreement with a major healthcare system worth $2.7 million. The signing had happened on Monday. She hadn't mentioned it to Andrew because they'd stopped sharing professional wins with each other somewhere along the way. the same way they'd stopped sharing everything else that mattered. But the contract had done something important. It had given her financial independence that she hadn't fully possessed before. Their mortgage was in both names, but she could carry it alone now if she needed to. She had leverage. She had options. She had the ability to walk away without financial devastation. And she had something else. Something Andrew had forgotten about in his arrogance. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. 3 years ago, when Andrew's company had been going through a major restructuring, he'd asked Christine to help him negotiate his VP contract. She'd reviewed the entire compensation package, caught several problematic clauses, and helped him secure better terms. In the process, she'd learned exactly how his stock options worked, how his bonuses were structured, and how much of his compensation was tied to tenure. She knew that if they divorced before his 5-year anniversary as VP, which was 14 months away, he'd forfeit approximately $600,000 in unvested stock. She knew that his bonus structure was tied to maintaining family health insurance, a relic from the company's older policies. She knew exactly where he was vulnerable, and she'd begun documenting everything the moment she'd noticed the pattern of late nights and changed behavior 6 months ago. The next morning, Christine called Laura Richmond, an attorney she'd worked with on a client case 2 years earlier. Laura specialized in high-asset divorces. They met for coffee at a quiet place in Northwest Portland. Christine laid out the timeline cleanly. The growing distance, the pattern of behavior, the text message, the suitcases. Laura listened with the focused attention of someone who'd heard 1,000 variations of this story but recognized when she was dealing with a client who'd already done the strategic thinking. "What do you want the outcome to be?" Laura asked. Christine didn't hesitate. "I want a clean break with fair asset division. I want to file before he has time to move money around or make changes to his compensation structure. And I want him to understand that underestimating me was the most expensive mistake he could have made." Laura smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed their work. "I can work with that," she said. They filed on Friday. For days after the suitcases, Andrew's attorney called the following Monday, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, informing Laura that her client was being unreasonable, and that Mr. Chun was willing to be generous in settlement discussions if Mrs. Chun would be more flexible about timeline. Laura's response was a masterclass in professional courtesy, wrapped around a steel core. She outlined Christine's position, the asset division she expected, and the timeline she required. She mentioned, almost casually, that they were aware of Mr. Chen's upcoming stock vesting schedule, and would be factoring that into settlement calculations. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Andrew's attorney said he'd get back to her. He called back 3 hours later with a settlement proposal that was significantly more reasonable. But Christine wasn't just playing the legal game. She was playing the longer one. Andrew worked in Portland's tight-knit tech community, where reputation mattered and word traveled fast. Christine had 15 years of professional relationships in that same community. She'd consulted for half the major companies in the area. She knew people. And while she would never directly badmouth Andrew, she didn't have to. The truth had a way of spreading on its own when you simply stopped managing the narrative. When colleagues asked how she was doing, she told them simply that she and Andrew were divorcing. When they asked why, she said that Andrew had decided to reconnect with an old girlfriend, and that she decided she deserved better. She said it calmly, without drama, the same way she'd say the weather was rainy, which somehow made it worse for Andrew, because Christine was respected, because people knew her as someone who didn't exaggerate or create drama, because when someone that credible tells you a simple truth, you believe it. The Whisper Network in Portland's professional community moved faster than Andrew anticipated. Within 2 weeks, 3 people had casually mentioned to him that they'd heard about the divorce and hoped he was doing okay. One was a board member at his company. Another was a potential business contact he'd been cultivating for a project. The third was his own boss, who called him in for a conversation about whether his personal issues were affecting his focus at work. Andrew had apparently assumed he could move on quietly, that this would be a private dissolution, that Sarah would seamlessly replace Christine without anyone particularly noticing or caring. He'd miscalculated badly. What he'd failed to understand was that Christine had spent 15 years building credibility and trust. She'd shown up. She'd delivered results. She'd treated people with respect and professionalism. When forced to choose sides in a divorce they knew nothing about, people defaulted to the person they trusted more. And they trusted Christine. The settlement took 6 weeks to finalize. Christine got the house. Andrew kept most of his stock options but had to buy out her share of the equity they'd built together, which required him to liquidate other investments at a loss. She kept her business. He kept his job but with the understanding that his professional reputation had taken damage that would take years to repair. They split other assets down the middle. She walked away with enough financial security to never have to think about him again. He walked away with significantly less than he would have had if he'd been honest a year earlier, or if he'd handled the situation with any degree of respect, or if he'd remembered that the woman he married was someone you didn't underestimate. The last time Christine saw Andrew in person was at the final settlement meeting. He looked tired, older. The confidence he'd carried like armor had developed cracks. Sarah hadn't lasted, apparently. Turned out that reconnecting with a college girlfriend at 43 hit differently than dating her at 22. Without the nostalgia and wine and excitement of an affair, they discovered they didn't actually like each other very much. Andrew had mentioned this to his attorney, who'd mentioned it to Laura, who'd told Christine over drinks after the settlement closed. Christine had felt nothing hearing it. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just the cool distance of someone watching events that no longer concerned her. As they signed the final papers, Andrew looked at her across the conference table. "I really did love you," he said quietly. Christine looked up from the document she was reviewing. She studied him for a moment, this man she'd spent 12 years with, who'd asked her to marry him overlooking the river, who'd told her she was the most brilliant person he'd ever met, who'd promised partnership and then delivered betrayal. "I believe you did," she said finally. "But you loved yourself more. And you assumed I'd love you enough to absorb the damage. That was your mistake." She signed her name, stood up, shook her attorney's hand, walked out into the Portland afternoon. She had lunch plans with a friend, then a client meeting at 3, then nothing but an empty evening in a house that was entirely hers. She felt lighter than she had in years. 6 months later, Christine stood in front of 200 people at a professional conference in Denver, delivering a keynote on strategic resilience in organizational change. The invitation had come through because of her work on the healthcare contract, which had exceeded every performance metric and led to 2 additional major clients. Her firm was growing. She'd hired 3 new consultants. She was sleeping well, dating occasionally, traveling for pleasure instead of just work, living a life that was completely her own design. During the Q&A session, someone asked how she maintained composure during high-pressure negotiations. Christine smiled. "I learned early that emotion is information, not instruction," she said. "You can feel angry or hurt or betrayed, but you don't have to let those feelings dictate your choices. You can acknowledge them, set them aside, and execute your strategy with clarity. That discipline, that ability to separate feeling from action, is what separates effective leaders from reactive ones." The audience applauded. She stepped off the stage, checked her phone, saw 3 new business inquiries in her email. Life was good. Life was hers. Andrew's text about catching up with his ex had been meant to manage her expectations, to soften the blow, to maintain some illusion of consideration while he did exactly what he wanted. Instead, It had been the catalyst that freed her from a marriage that had been slowly suffocating both of them. His arrogance had assumed she'd fight for him, beg him to stay, make it easy for him to have everything he wanted. Her response, those suitcases by the door, had been the clearest communication she'd ever given him. You don't get to betray me and keep me. You don't get to disrespect me and expect me to manage your comfort. You made your choice. Now live with it. And he was living with it, while Christine was thriving. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you that self-respect is worth more than any relationship, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Leora Folktales for more stories of courage, consequence, and justice. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Christine's position. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept treatment you don't deserve. The suitcases weren't revenge. They were respect. For herself. And that made all the difference. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.